So let us begin with prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we thank you for giving us an opportunity to come together again for the gift of faith and the gift of life that you have given us, and the opportunities we have to think about the choices that we make and how we might help others to make good choices as well. We read in the book of James, "Know this, my dear brothers, everyone should be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. For the wrath of a man does not accomplish the righteousness of God. Therefore put away all filth and evil excess, and humbly welcome the word that has been placed in you and is able to save your souls. Be doers of the word and not hearers only, deluding yourself. For if anyone is only a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks at his own face in a mirror. He sees himself and then goes off promptly, forgets what he looks like. But the one who peers in the perfect law of freedom and perseveres, and is not a hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, such a one shall be blessed in what he does." The word of the Lord. In the Father, and Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Any questions from last time? Okay. So what religion were the founding fathers of our country? Christian. Some of them Christians. Deist, but many of them were just deists, right? Some of them, there was a couple of Catholic founding fathers and several Protestant, Puritans, different types of Christians, but some of them were just deists that weren't particularly religious at all, but believed in God and in God's providence and believed that the Creator gave us rights. How far back is the term Judeo-Christian used in the discussion of values and principles? Yeah, about 150 years. But in the 19th century, they start to pick up that word to describe the value system that underlies the American society. But this was not a classic understanding that Judeo-Christian values were united. There was obviously common foundation to it, but on the United States, we get this idea that these both point in the same directions. Why is human life precious? Because we're made in God's image. We're a creature that is created to last forever. And that immortality brings with it a dignity, that our life is not just a random result, but is a chosen act of God's will. And with it comes a responsibility to do something useful with the life that we have received. A word about prudential judgments. People of goodwill can differ about prudential judgments. Justice recognizes the rights of another, and people of goodwill should recognize what the rights of another are and honor those. Temperance and courage, that's common to the circumstance. But prudence, people of goodwill can make a different judgment as in this particular circumstance, what is the best thing to do and the best way to do it. A prudential judgment has to be just, but it's not strictly a matter of justice. And there's a tendency when looking at moral circumstances where people wish it's a matter of justice. What do I need to do? Oh, you must do this, right? You cannot kill. So that option's off the table. But the prudential judgment in this circumstance, how do we proceed? And that's prudence is the virtue that helps one to do what is best in a particular situation, all things considered truthfully. And somebody I worked with a long time ago at Eastman, they said, all things being equal, he will make the choice that's best for the company and himself. All things not being equal, he'll make the choice that's best for the company. I said, that's fair. And they go, oh, no, absolutely fair. All things being equal, He chooses the good of the company and his own good. But if they're not equal, he doesn't pretend they are equal. And so the prudential judgment is one of the virtues, prudence, that balances all the other ones in the particular circumstance. What is the best course of action to take? And two people can judge that differently. And so you can have people making different choices about how to address a particular situation. When you go over at the break, is it better to take 3 cookies or 2 cookies and a piece of cake? And that's a calculus you have to make. But if you're diabetic, probably you need to make the choice of a couple of pieces of fruit instead. Actions have effects on human persons. Somebody goes out and runs all the time, they become a runner. They become healthier, and they probably even get addicted to the endorphins of running. So they become, it becomes a habit for them. They just run. What we do has physical effects on us. What we eat has effects on us, but the actions and choices we make also has effect on us spiritually, on the kind of person that we become. If we do good, generous things, we become a good, generous person. If we do selfish, self-serving things, we become more selfish and self-serving. So what we do forms who we become. It's one of the reasons that human actions are so very important, because it's not just the consequences on what happens to other people and around us. Our actions have consequences upon ourselves. The formation of virtues, the Greeks before the time of Christ came up with this language, a habit, a character. A habit is something we do second nature without a second thought. The virtuous person doesn't have to stop and consider what is the thing to do in this situation. They spontaneously, easily, quickly, readily know. The person who doesn't have the virtues has to go and deliberate and struggle to make the choice in the particular situation. So somebody whose appetites are not well cured goes over and really agonizes about what choice to make, where somebody who has healthy habits goes over, makes it, and it's not a matter of having to make a heavy choice. Societal trends is an observation that a secular society claims to respect diversity, but has a real tension in tolerating religious differences, especially the modern secular society, because religion just cannot be imposed in the secular world. Religion needs to be kept out of the secular life. And so accommodating and tolerating religious differences is very difficult, because they want religion to have no impact in the public square. And this becomes then not respectful of diversity, but only of certain kinds of diversity, the ones that they select. And so while in principle the secular world should be neutral to all coming opinions, it tends to be very biased. Some opinions are more acceptable than others. This leads to a polarization. In our society, people become more and more rigidly divided, more and more angst-filled with the complexity of the world around us, and more polarized that the problem is those people. If those people would just be more like me, the world would be a better place. Right? Simple enough thing. There's a challenge in our society for preserving identities, cultural identities, versus assimilation. Some of this is easy. Dietary laws, practices, fairly easily tolerated. We tolerate vegans. We tolerate people who don't want to eat ham, and we accommodate them. People put on their menus vegan dishes, gluten-free dishes, keto dishes, used to be at one point Weight Watcher dishes. Whatever the customers want to buy, the market will try to accommodate. And dietitians back in the 40s, 50s, 60s even in the 70s, they had their meatless day on Friday in most places because they were not going to serve meat every day. And so Friday was a good day not to serve meat because the Catholics wouldn't eat meat anyway. So the culture accepted that and fit it into their schedule without anybody realizing this is an imposition of a religious value. This just made good sense because then the kids were eating their lunches instead of throwing them away. The abayas, I believe it's pronounced, the outer garment that the Muslim women wear that covers everything except hands, face, feet. In most cultures, that's tolerated. In France, a few years back, they banned it in the schools because it was coming divisive amongst those who wore it and the ones who didn't wear it. And it became, in a certain measure, almost like a gang symbol. Yet another reason why uniforms in schools are handy things. But society can accommodate people dressing in general, however they want to dress, but in a place like a school environment, this can become a problem. And it becomes an even bigger problem when people are insisting that other people observe the dress code that they think that they should have, that no one should be allowed to show more than their face and their hands and their feet. Preserving identity can be a problem with imposing beliefs because some beliefs are very difficult for people that hold to them not to try to impose them on others. If you're a radical jihadist and believe that all the infidels should be killed, it is difficult not to seek that out in policy. The Hamas radical extremist group desires that Israel be taken off the face of the earth. It's from the river to the sea. Being Palestine, there's no place for Israel. Well, that is hard to assimilate and accommodate with Israel being a Jewish nation. Even for the Muslim communities wanting to practice their Sharia laws in some of the communities where they want to be able to discipline members of their community for their own community's violations, so that if a woman goes out and lets her face be seen by somebody other than a family member or goes out without a man, that the Sharia law calls for a punishment and they want to be able to impose that punishment. And many countries in Europe are struggling with how do you balance their right to maintain their culture with the right of the broader society. In the United States, at one point, we followed the model of being a melting pot that everybody assimilated in and eventually became to a common ground. Then it became a stew pot where each flavor of the ingredients was different, but it all worked together. Now it's a bit more like a 3-compartment plate where these things sometimes don't mix. But as a principle, witnessing to your values, but try not to impose your beliefs. This is what Jesus sent the apostles out to do. To go out and proclaim the good news, to share what they had encountered in Christ. And if other people didn't accept it, shake the dust from your feet and go on about your way. The apostles weren't set out to force everyone to believe, to live their life in a certain way, but to give witness. St. Francis of Assisi is credited with telling his followers to go out and proclaim the gospel always, and when you have to, you can use words, because the witness is such a more powerful testimony. And the values that we witness to are values largely about the dignity of the human person, which isn't founded principally in a religious belief, but in the reality of who and what the human person is. Now, people may have different opinions of this, but ancient Greeks before the coming of Christ that had no connection to the God of Revelation at all came to realize that there was a God, like the founding fathers, there's a creator, and that human persons have a body and a soul, and that the soul is eternal. The Greeks knew this just by reason. So we don't have to support our values on the fact that they're religious beliefs, but to try to share the truth that we have received in a culture that often doesn't want to know that. The cancel culture becomes a problem, removing statues, removing posts from the past, rewriting history. Back in the early 1900s and other times in history, history was only rewritten when one dictator fell out of power and a new dictator came in, right? I forget whether it was Lenin or Stalin that was first, but the other one came in and the other one's name was struck from history. Then a couple of generations down the line, they're reclaimed from the ash pit of history again. But the removing of statues, posts, the idea that we're surprised that people in the past were not perfect, that this is somehow a shock, that there are some things wrong with George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or Martin Luther King Jr. or anybody except Jesus Christ and our Blessed Mother. But the idea that we just erase them from history as if they never existed, this doesn't actually help us to face reality in a better way. The Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition has been always very clear on this. The scriptures don't pull any punches on King David. With all the good things David did, there's also the killing of Uriah and the counting of the number of people of Israel that brought punishment to the people. St. Peter, St. Paul, these people, Paul led the execution of Stephen, the first martyr. But we accept that people are fallen and broken. They're going to do good things and bad things. And if we can no longer recognize them for the good things, but have to condemn them for the bad things, we lose any semblance of reality. Because who can you have a statue of? Probably the people that are pulling down the statues until another half generation goes along and find out that they were left-handed instead of right-handed. They never spoke out on behalf of left-handers in all their writings, right? They never spoke about people who have blue eyes needing to be treated with equal dignity, right? There's always going to be something that people didn't do, and maybe things that they did that were evil, wicked, sinister, but it doesn't make them bad. Now, one of the lessons that we can learn is be slow to make heroes out of people. When Lady Di passed away, it was very close to the time of Teresa of Calcutta. And the response was actually very similar. You had people outside of Buckingham Palace holding vigils, putting candles, putting flowers, etc. And if you were just new into the earth, you would look at that and go, whoa, Lady Diana and Teresa of Calcutta, they are two women that must have been twin sisters separated at birth because of the outpouring for them. But a few years later, that's very different. So one of the things for the canonization process is you wait at least 5 years after they're dead before you begin the investigation. And then it's at least 5 years after that before they're declared venerable and blessed. And 5 years after that, in addition to a couple of miracles along the way. But that reality that none of the canonized saints were perfect. They all did bad things. And we're not surprised by that people are shocked and cannot deal with human failures. This is unsustainable because they're making mistakes in their lives as well. And they cannot acknowledge that if they can't deal with the reality that people are not perfect. I had a person I worked with at one point, her goal was to have everything be perfect. And when it wasn't perfect, she could not handle it. So she was really good as long as everyone says, oh, that was perfect. Everything went so great. But it's like, everyone's so great, but it would have been really helpful if we'd had the coffee made before everybody showed up. And she would crater because the idea that it wasn't perfect, that was the drive. And it's like, God plants Adam and Eve in the garden in the perfect place, and it didn't work out for him. The chance that we're going to have a perfect program, zero. Wokeism. Woke begins being used in the African American community as an expression of being awakened to cultural realities that work against them. It to help them to begin looking how they interact in a broader society. But like many things, that term then gets picked up and used by other people, and not infrequently gets turned around and becomes pejorative against even the very ones who came up with the use of it originally. This is when people object to cultural assimilation. It's not that we like tacos. That's generally not too offensive. But that we all start wearing sombreros, cultural appropriation. We start using words that other ethnic groups use, especially when they get used in a way that works against them. This is not polite. It's not courteous. But wokeism is just kind of the updated word for politically correct. People gotten tired of politically correct, right? Certain things you cannot say or do or think or motion to because it will be offensive to some group or someone. Not always rooted in the sacred dignity of the person, but avoiding something that is a trigger, real or imagined. There were some legitimate points about political correct things, but the idea that the real problem is you just can't use that word. Well, that doesn't bring respect to other people. Post-liberal, I don't know if you've seen, but the new vice presidential candidate, Vance, identifies himself as a post-liberal conservative, that he is a conservative not in the conservative liberal spectrum, but conservative in a way that is post that liberal distinction and is grounded in a respect for the common good, not just the rights of the individual. So I thought it was interesting that he applies that label to himself, because that's not one of the labels that's used in the common discussion. Curiosity versus studiousness. In our society, we feed curiosity. People seek information, not for some practical use, some out of fear of missing out, but some just because they're curious, they just want to know. Studiousness is about learning something that will be useful for some purpose. The studious person actually can't go around socially showing off how much he knows. That's considered to be rude for the person who's got the advanced specialized education to be just flaunting how much he knows. This is ill-mannered. The curious person goes around all the time sharing what they know. Did you know so-and-so said this? Do you know so-and-so said that? Right? And they do that in order to pull out more pieces of information, because they're never going to give up everything they know, because they got to have one more piece than you got. But right, but we live in a culture that plays on curiosity, and it feeds it endlessly. And you're watching a movie, and someone's like, "I wonder what other movie that actor starred in." They pull out their phone while watching the movie, pull it up, and find out all the movies they starred in, how much movie, which is the biggest grossing movie ever had, right? Endless trail. Bishop Carrata said one of the reasons he didn't have a computer and the internet was because he knew he tended to be curious. He says, I have enough trouble when I pick up a book of the church fathers looking for something particular, not getting sucked into all the pages. He says, I would never be able to turn my eyes away from the computer screen, be able to like, oh, this Peter Christologos cites Augustine's work. Let's look at Augustine's work. Let's look at the Greek sources that he's referencing. It's endless. But that knowledge is used actually in service is an important thing. Development of peoples. Authentic development of peoples recognizes their sacred dignity and promotes their authentic freedom. This isn't just economic development. This is social, political, human development. The social justice teachings of the church, which began being really formalized very near the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s, and have been repeated over the last 125 years or so now, 140 years probably coming up. The dignity of every person needs to be respected. And that brings with it the dignity of human labor. What a person does with their time and energy, with their life, has a value not just determined by economics. That human labor is not just another resource for the industrial machine, that we need a certain amount of coal, we need a certain amount of fabric, and we need a certain man hours to run the sewing machines. That human labor is different than the other resources of production, that people are entitled to the fruits of their labor in some real way. Vatican II, Gaudium et Spes, which is the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world, begins saying the joy and hope for humanity is found in Christ, in understanding who the human person is, not with an idea that we have to impose belief in Jesus Christ upon everybody in the world, but that understanding the truth of who the human person is and who the human person is in relation to their creator and in relation to creation that flows out of that, that this is needed, because if society doesn't have this, they're going to run into troubles with economic inequity, the broadening gap between developed and underdeveloped peoples, with the exploitation, with trafficking and slavery, with marriage and family. And if you ever take the time to read Gaudium et Spes, you go through the beginning part saying, these things could be a real problem. They wrote like in 1964, 1965. And you read it and go, oh yeah, those all became real problems. But the idea that the church has an expertise to offer to society, that it precisely needs to have a voice in the debate, not to impose the values, but to give witness to a truth that has been acquired over time and with the help of revelation. So the world isn't just a chessboard where the big players are jockeying the pawns around. As a principle, the things of this world should be shared for the world's benefit. That there's something wrong with a powerful nation buying up the rights to rare earth minerals and paying people minimum wages to extract those minerals so that they can capture and control the world market on them and control the price to control the building of batteries that we need for electric vehicles. This China, not the US in this example of exploitation. We're not the only exploiters in the world, but they did learn from the experts. But that people have a right to more than just the minimum sustenance, and that the country that has those resources should benefit from those resources. And just because somebody's rich enough to come and buy them doesn't mean that they should get control of them. Leaders should be servants. Jesus says, those of you who would be the greatest must be the servant of all. We certainly live in a culture that has lost this sense of leaders being servants. There was a time where leaders stepped forward, took offices of leadership, more or less exclusively in a role of service, and then went back to whatever else they were doing. But that idea that leaders should be servants is fundamental to our Christian perspective, that leaders not about being the most powerful, the most famous, the most brilliant person in the world. Starvation and hunger are huge problems around the world precisely because of this failure for the development of peoples. We have failed to help raise much of the world out of poverty. It is almost the case that the U.S. throws away enough food to feed a lot of the starving people in the world. We certainly have the technology to be able to produce food, but it's monetized. And so the distribution of food isn't easy, and the political realities are very complicated. And you send food relief to Iran for the starving people there, and the controlling people pick it up, and their family is no longer starving. Their allies' families are no longer starving. Their enemies' families are probably still starving. In Gaza, you ship truckloads of food in, and Hamas takes control of it if you're not careful and distributes it out to the very people that are trying to kill people in Israel instead of the innocent bystanders getting it, because distributing food is hard. The world's a very big place. But what you really need in the world is real development of people to where countries are lifted out of the cycle of poverty. That places where there's starvation, the developed world says, okay, what do we do? What do we do to help the countries in Africa that are facing these droughts that are epic, right? What can be done to make the situation better instead of just ignoring it because it's not a problem for us, because there's no economic impact on us, until those people start fleeing over to Europe and flood Europe, and then the European Union gets involved, and they're mad and don't want all these immigrants. But looking to the development of peoples to recognize the sacred dignity of each person, and what do we do to help countries really develop? But the free market system believes in supply and demand, but one of the ways to keep the supply controlled is by power. You keep competition eliminated. It keeps your position in the chain stable. So starvation, hunger, a huge problem in the world that we can't do anything about. But it turns out there are also people that are hungry in Lamar County. I think that they said there was 3 people that are hungry in Lamar County. It's not a big problem here. It's like the drug use problem. There's almost no one, but there are some. But if we saw the hungry people, people would be inclined to feed them. So things are done to keep hungry people in the shadows, because everybody feels better that we don't see these problems that you see on certain streets in the big cities. The Native American peoples, just as an example of this problem with development, shifting policies. Sometimes it's good to policy shift. When the prevailing idea is the only good Indian is a dead Indian, it's good that that policy shifts. That extermination isn't our plan. So that's an improvement. But the Indian agents often made a lot of profit on the margins and not helping the Indians fairly. And at one point, the government's plan for the Native American peoples was to help them become established, back them in loans for small businesses and loans for farming, to buy equipment, to get established, and become autonomous. Then came a policy change out of Washington we're not going to back that loan program any longer. We're just going to give you money. It'll be cheaper for us. But giving people money doesn't help development of peoples. It makes them dependent, which can be convenient for political and economic reasons, right? Ronald Reagan famously that one time said, I just came from the Interior Department through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and there was a man sobbing at his desk, and I asked him, what's wrong? And Reagan he said, my Indian died. The idea that every agent in the Bureau of Indian Affairs had their own Indian because the bureaucracy was so big and so expensive, even though the Native American population is not so big. But you shift policy pretty easily from helping people along a path to development, which takes more resources and takes more time. And then you impoverish them in a ghetto and put them on the reservations and give them money. What could possibly go wrong with this plan? Drug use off the chart, human trafficking, sex trading off the charts, violence, crime, and it's not a problem because nobody sees it. The boarding schools come up, the tragedy that occurred in many of the boarding schools. And as a culture, we have a hard time acknowledging that bad things happened in the past. Some bad things happened intentionally, some bad things happened out of ignorance. But just like we can't keep a statue up, we can't acknowledge that in the past, there were bad things that happened. But we can't change the past. One of the things working with survivors and people affected by abuse is that you have to give up any hope to have had a better past. No matter what you do, your past isn't going to be different than it was. You can have a different perspective on it, but that's about having a better present. It's not about changing the past. And so we, as a culture, don't have to be polarized with either the boarding schools were the best things in the world or they were the worst things in the world. They were, like most things, fallen broken. And how do we approach living in the present in a way that does help the authentic development of people? That does help people come to recognize their sacred dignity, to respect their culture. There was an article written recently. There was a Native American icon of Christ that was removed from a chapel on the reservation by some priest who thought it was a good idea to remove it. But the Native peoples were like, the priest said we had to choose between Catholic and being Native American. And I've been Catholic my whole life. My grandparents were Catholic their whole life. We've never had to choose between this. So it's not that they're rejecting always Christianity. Many of them embrace Christianity despite all the problems that occurred in Christian boarding schools as well as in state-run boarding schools. But how do they live that out in their life circumstance without having to adapt everything that is Western European? And this looking to the development of people is an essential thing that hardly ever comes up in the debate, right? We're not looking at Ukraine. What are we doing to develop that nation back? Afghanistan, we leave it. We just leave it. And what historically happens is it blows up again and again and again. So, any questions? Yeah, right. Shake the dust from your feet was well, it was a distancing yourself from them, right? It was a distancing yourself from them. I am not carrying your dust with me, right? But um, it's um, it's a pretty good image because oftentimes when somebody disses us, we don't shake the dust from our feet. We stir up a big dust storm. and we carry it with us, right? We go down the road ranting and raving about, can you believe those people didn't accept us, et cetera, right? But you shake your dust from the feet, you separate yourself from it in a very strong image. But that shaking the dust off, I have no part of them, and I go on my way. But yeah, it was not a welcoming gesture. It was a gesture of distancing oneself from them, but not condemnation to them, not inflicting penalty on them. You don't want this? Okay, I'm not going to force you to take it. There's Jesus says, it will go better for Sodom and Gomorrah on the last day than for you, Capernaum, because you have a greater, the queen of the south will rise up in judgment because she converted the wisdom of Solomon, and you have one greater than Solomon here. That Jesus says it's going to harder for this generation because you have received more. And to whom more is given, more is expected. That's one of our basic principles. So we recognize people in the past did bad things, but we have to also recognize we have responsibility what we do with ours in our days, our ages. Other questions, comments? So war and terrorism, there's a saying, all is fair in love and war. It's not true. It's not true in love and it's not true in war. And especially in our Western tradition. Because our Western tradition has recognized that violence should not be the first response. There may become a time where violence is necessary, but it's not the first thing that one should try. There's an obligation for protecting innocence reasonably or heroically. The obligation to protect innocence is what is reasonable. One can go to heroic lengths to protect innocence, but one is not obligated to go to heroic lengths to protect innocence. So if somebody comes in to shoot me, I do not have to defend myself. Somebody comes in to shoot you, Don has to defend you. Right? There's an obligation that others would do what they can to protect you. Right? This is particularly in society, the responsibility leadership of society to maintain the common good, which is to protect from enemies, foreign and domestic, we say. Somebody could defend in a reasonable way, but somebody could do something heroic that isn't just reasonable. So somebody could jump between her and the bullet. That's an heroic option, right? You're not obligated to that. That's the extra mile that Jesus love as I love, right? So somebody's in a swollen river in the middle of a flood, and rescuing them is really dangerous. It's heroic when somebody has sufficient skills and goes not foolhardily, but puts himself in on a good likelihood they can get out. Probably. But sometimes people die doing heroic things. A lifeguard at a pool has an obligation to jump in to pull somebody out of the pool, right? But you're walking along and there's a full swollen river with a child in the swollen river. You don't have an obligation to jump in the river, especially if it's unreasonable because you can't swim, right? You're going to make somebody down the river have to have two people to pull out. But a person can jump in and help push that person to safety, even if they die in the process. And we recognize this is heroic. right? Heroes aren't always successful. But that obligation to protect innocent life, I don't have to protect my own, but I can't choose martyrdom for somebody else. The just war theory, which comes out of the Western world, the idea that you have limits for war, that you have something like the Geneva Convention, that if soldiers are in uniform, you can fight them on the field. If you capture them, you detain them. You cannot torture them. You have to feed them. You cannot force them to do more than a certain amount of physical labors. And this is governed by rules. Spies could be shot because they weren't in uniform. That violated the rule of war, right? But if they're in uniform, this is what has to be done. In Afghanistan, the Taliban, well, they have no uniforms, okay? That's the first clue. But the reason they will blow up a school bus full of children, because a school bus full of children or a bus full of soldiers, it's the same. They're all the enemy. But in the Western world, this well-developed sense of a just war theory, that there are times where war is just, but not to be the first option. It has to be engaged for a just cause, some serious evil, engaged as a last resort, attempts to bring about an end of the evil in some other way have all failed. It has to be declared by a proper authority. We can't decide to engage a war against the gangs. The government can decide that because the government has responsibility for defending the common good. Vigilantes don't have the authority to engage a war. Possessing the right intention, not just to address the evil, that's a good intention, but my intention may be, oh, this gives me excuse to go and take their property that I want to have. Having a reasonable chance of success. The battle has to be winnable, and it has to be winnable at a reasonable cost, a cost proportionate. Proportional means have to be used. So the Taliban takes down the World Trade Center. We can't just send a nuclear missile or several nuclear missiles and wipe Afghanistan off the map. Not proportioned. Now, the prudential judgments that have to be made in this are many. Israel suffers on October 7th, 1,000-something deaths that day and several hundred taken, which I think would have been like 30,000 people killed on 9/11 in our country and 5,000 taken hostage. Big numbers. We'd have been really mad, right? They would not be sleeping nights for a long time to come. But how do you weigh that proportioned cost when 6 months later we have 30,000 people dead, including 8,000 Hamas and 20,000 civilians? It's a tough prudential judgment to make. But if you don't keep in mind the principles, you find yourself getting into a war that you can never get out of. Because when Bush went into Iraq, the Bishop Carrata said he's got to see it to the end, but it's going to be hard to tell where the end is, because they didn't articulate exactly clearly why. Because we're going to take the fighting to them instead of fighting them here is not part of the just war theory, right? There was a serious wrong. It needs to be addressed. Legitimate authority needs to address it. It has to be addressed at proportionate cost. Well, this requires that you articulate these things and you think through it, which will suggest to you when you've completed the mission. Because when you just go in because you're mad as hell you have a hard time knowing when to get out. And comes like in Afghanistan, where they decide one day, we're leaving in 90 days. And if you've ever tried to get moved out of a house in 90 days, you know how difficult that is. And it comes down at the last minute, you go, forget it, just leave everything behind. Somebody else will take care of it, right? It's crazy. But it comes about because we lose track of the just war. That the purpose of the just war is not revenge. It is that this will help us to address the injustice and to stop the injustice. But when you go in and when you leave, the situation is within a year almost exactly what it was when you started. Something's wrong, right? And part of what's wrong is the discipline to say we don't really want to be at war, no matter how much money we can make off of it. And but this idea of limiting war is a very Western thing. Many cultures of the world do not recognize this. The Taliban do not recognize the rules of war. The Islamic perspective is radical Islam wants Armageddon. They want the battle at the end of the world because at Armageddon, the great prophet will return and Allah wins his great victory. So you threaten to blast Iran off the face of the earth, and there's leaders in Iran that go, yes, praise Allah, the prophet will return and we'll be spared and we'll be victorious, right? So it's very difficult to deal with a culture that wants the end of the world. Now, it turns out that most individuals don't want the end of the world to come right now today, right? So when Osama bin Laden is dragged out of the hole he's hiding in, he's whimpering, right? Was that reality of being willing to lay everything down turns out to be very difficult for the human person. Radical Islam sees violence being in service of establishing the right order in the world, which is that humanity will serve Allah, God, and that service of Allah will be rewarded. If you die fighting for Allah, fighting for God, He will reward you. The Muslims have no expectation to be rewarded with heaven where they're in God's fellowship. They do not see themselves as sons and daughters of God. That's blasphemous that you would make of yourself a God, because Allah is the all-powerful, almighty one who has to be served in a way that a horse serves its master. And when the horse is done its work for the master and gets older, the horse gets put out to pasture. If the horse has been really good, the horse may get stud services as well. But this is the reward, a reward of paradise of this world's nature, right? This is what they have to look forward to, having served Allah, that He will reward them with a good retirement plan. Sometimes Christians will say, we've got the best retirement plan. Well, no, we don't actually, because it's not a retirement plan, right? We have sonship. That's not repayment for the work we did. That's the joy of being sons and daughters of the King of Kings. So there are cultures that have radically different views than the Western civilization. And it makes it very difficult because in fighting Nazi Germany, Germans held mostly to the same kind of principles that the Allies held to. The Jews didn't count because the Jews weren't really recognized as humans. The Germans didn't treat American prisoners too well, but they weren't burning American prisoners in gas chambers like they were the Jews. So Japan, I don't know that Japan signed into the Geneva conventions. Certainly Afghanistan did not recognize, the Taliban did not recognize the Geneva Conventions. Their idea that war would somehow be limited is crazy. What do you mean, non-combatants? So Hamas, every Israeli is an enemy. So they have no qualm of killing innocent. They're just killing enemies. And the idea that you only kill people that are wearing uniforms can't compute. So we're dealing as a culture with people that are radically different. Questions? You cannot do wrong that good may come of it. But your prudential judgments are going to be different in the fact that the enemy isn't going to treat your soldiers as well as you're going to treat theirs. Right? So that has to go in the calculus of how you respond. You have an enemy that wants to be martyred, that wants to be blown off the face of the earth. You got to be slow to give them what they want, right? Because their goal may be to force you into reacting in a way that you don't want to do. I mean, the Soviets, they're Easterners of a type, but they are influenced by this general thought of Western world. They have no desire to be blown off the face of the earth. Iraq, Iran leadership, some of those, yeah, bring it on. The destruction of the world, looking forward to that day. Now, for the Christians, the end of the world is not the end of the world, but none of us are like, let's speed it up a little bit. Right? Right? We know Jesus comes at the end of the world, and when he comes, will he find any faith in the world? The world may well end on a bad note. But we don't desire that. And there are people who do desire it. There are criminals and crazy people and things that don't want to commit suicide, but want death by cop, that put themselves in a position that they're going to have to be shot because they don't have the stomach for suicide, but they're going to do the things necessary that they're going to die in the process. And they may take some out with them and become famous in that regard. But the prudential judgment of how in the particular circumstance one does, this is why responding with love is very essential and not reacting. Because somebody wants to get in a fight with you and they call you a name, do you really want to give them the satisfaction of engaging the fight? And so sometimes the better part of valor is you stand down and stand back. Because if you react, they have control. If you respond, you don't have unlimited control, but we never have unlimited control. But you have at least more control than if you're reacting. Does that make sense? But the prudential judgment is very difficult. Somebody asked about Hiroshima and Nagasaki this morning on the just war. It's a debated point. It's a debated point because it targeted a lot of civilians. Now, as I recall, Nagasaki was a big industrial city, so it hit critical infrastructure, but a lot of civilians died. And this violates one of our things. And how you weigh that is a heavy responsibility because you have an obligation to protect the innocent. And thankfully, I didn't have to make that decision. But reasonable people should be able to recognize it's not an easy decision to make because we don't really come from a tradition that says somebody pokes your eye out, you go and cut off their arm. The worst our tradition did was an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Jesus calls us to something different than that. But a restrained response was the Judeo-Christian response. And that's not fun, because if somebody does, you take one of ours, we'll take two of yours. Then they'll come and take four of ours, then we have to take eight of theirs. And this is how war gets started. Okay. Yes. Now, that reasonable chance of success may be very small, but the Masada, the Jewish fortress that was up on the mountain that the Romans laid siege to, and nobody except the Romans would have ever breached it, because nobody else would have the time to build up the siege ramps and the siege mechanisms and pound the daylights out of an impenetrable fortress on top of a hill. But when they go in, what do they find? Everybody's dead, right? They killed themselves. This is not a Christian response, right? We'll face martyrdom, but we don't kill ourselves in the face of it. I understand, but because you hold the hill as long as you can, because there may come a turn in the battle, which happens not infrequently, sometimes by a miracle, sometimes by a nudge, but sometimes it doesn't happen and everyone ends up dead. And sometimes people go to heroic lengths and are successful, right? But if there is absolutely no chance, then we don't undertake the mission. We don't send out kamikaze pilots. Not in our culture, right? Where the plan is you go and kill yourself and take as many of them you can with you. We send out pilots in very difficult circumstances. We send out pilots where it's like, and after you complete the mission, you try to get your plane to China and ditch it. You ditch in the water and you swim as far as you can, and we'll pick you up if we can, right? We send people on missions that have slim chances of success, but oftentimes get people back. But we don't undertake missions with no plan of coming back in general, right? And many heroic stories of special forces people that got out of impossible circumstances. We sent astronauts to the moon, and when they had difficulties, we got them back alive. We lost a couple in catastrophic failures, but the Soviets sent a lot of people up and never got them back, because getting them back's optional. The value of the human person is not as great. So let's take a break, and we'll start back again in 10 minutes. So any questions that came to mind over the break? One look at addictions. Aristotle, before the coming of Christ, came to recognize and develop the idea of virtues, the Greek philosophers, that virtue stands in the middle, that between excesses of engagement or excesses of avoidance, the virtue stands in the middle. The properly balanced life was what the Greek philosophers desired to have as being valuable, and that it was possible for the human person to develop a character where they spontaneously, easily, readily recognized and followed the path that was at the appropriate balance in the appropriate measure in the circumstances. That this was a sign of somebody who was a good man. This is understanding of the human person based in the only in observing the created world, not with the help of revelation. but that virtue stands in the middle. There's a problem because our appetites are not spontaneously ordered to the good. Our appetites at times will misguide us, or they are disordered. They are not ordered to the true good. Why are appetites not easily ordered to the true good? Sin. Genesis chapter 3, the fall, right? There's a disharmony between us and God. There's a disharmony between us as individuals, and there's a disharmony within ourselves. They call it concupiscence, that disharmony within ourselves, that our appetites do not spontaneously point us in the right direction. Now, Eve in the garden had an appetite for something more than what she had. She wanted more than what she had, and she willed and chose to reach out and take the fruit. That fruit looks good. It looks like it'd be tasty. And I want to be like God. Indeed, she was created to be like God, but she wanted to control that. And so she reached out and took it. Her appetites were not particularly disordered. They were ordered to her good of being like God, but she willed to fulfill the appetites or try to fulfill the appetites by something other than God, by seeking the knowledge of good and evil. So our appetites, even before the fall, did not only desire the good in light of the truth, because they're ordered towards particular goods, not to the absolute good, but she in her free will chose to follow the appetites in a bad way. We suffer because our appetites don't just desire a good, they desire all kinds of things. And the more we feed those cravings, the stronger those cravings become. Refined sugar is extremely habit forming. They say if you're off it long enough, you don't even want a cookie. I'm not sure. I mean, I've heard tell there are people that get up in the morning and want to go and run 5 miles. I think this is disordered, but I accept that people could do this. But addictions come about with people coping or not coping with reality. People that are happy and content with where their life's at and everything's good and are comfortable, like, don't need a glass of wine because my life's good. Don't need to go and run 5 miles because my life's good, right? Right? Don't need 20 glasses of wine because my life's not that bad, right? Right? There are the 3 glass days that don't happen when everything is going perfectly well. But oftentimes with the addictions, people are not just coping or not coping with reality, they're trying to self-medicate. They have depression or anxiety or trauma or fear, and they don't know what else to do with it except to deaden it. And so they seek from drugs, they seek from alcohol, they seek from shopping, they seek from engaging in social media, a distraction away from their pain in some measure. The addictions oftentimes are providing some kind of a distraction from problems they want to face or problems they want to not face. I had a nephew who would go to a counselor for a few months and then unexpectedly drop off. Looking back on it, what's happening is you get to the point of where you're going to have to open up that door. And your mind is protecting you from having to open up that door. So you don't refuse to open the door. You don't go to the next meeting because she's going to say, there's a door there, you ought to open it. So you're very smart. So your defensive mechanism works 2 moves ahead. She never asks you to open the door because she doesn't know it's there. And you don't have to see it because you avoid putting yourself in a spot where she might say, hey, there's a door. But distracting from problems consciously or unconsciously. Alcohol, drugs, gambling, tobacco, pornography, shopping, eating. The substances or the human actions, they have physiological effects and they can be habit forming and, in fact, addictive. Habits, we mentioned, are second nature, things done without giving it a second thought. I had a cousin who was a priest when I was a kid, and he was a chain smoker. He would light one cigarette off of the other cigarette, and the ash on his cigarettes would be this long, and he would usually get someplace where he could drop them off conveniently, but sometimes they would just fall wherever he was. And when I was a kid, one time they fell on my arm. I was like, ouch, that hurt. It did hurt. Hot ash. It's like, oh, sorry. Just trying to get outside of the room to drop them on the ground. But he never thought about how many cigarettes he consumed. He didn't make a decision about having the next cigarette. It just, when one was going out, automatically the other one came. There is with these things a stage of use and then misuse and then abuse. Alcohol, a glass of wine brings joy to the heart, the psalmist acknowledges, right? But sometimes we start looking forward to the glass of alcohol a little too much. And we start having the second and third glass before we finish cooking supper, right? I mean, I've talked to people that have found this trouble. They're like, Father, my life is better if I don't have my first glass of wine until supper is prepared, because I find myself on a bad day having 2 or 3 glasses of wine before supper's prepared. And I think that's not good. So they recognize there's a misuse stage. They adjust it so it doesn't slide over into the abuse. These substances have effects on the person, the mind, the body, the spirit, and person's relationships. There's physiological things that happen. Pornography has the same kind of effect in the mind as hard drugs. It stimulates the minds in the same way that drugs stimulate the mind. So it's extremely habit forming. Shopping, the endorphins that are released from finding the great deal, right? Eating, food disorders, where people eat excessively and then purge, or they don't eat healthy amounts, or they eat certain kinds of foods in excess. If there's ice cream in the house, they eat it all until it's gone, right? Right. So they know that even if the gallon of Bluebell ice cream is on sale, half gallon of Bluebell ice cream is on sale, they need to get the pint, because they will eat the container of ice cream when they get home. So know yourself. But the effect in the mind and the body and the spirit and in relationships can be very damaging to a person, because one, it distracts time and energy away from other good things. When one is engaged in shopping endlessly on the internet, or engaged in pornography on the internet, or social media on the internet, one is not engaged with other people around them. When one is drunk and passed out, one is not available to do good things for the building up the kingdom of God. So it has both physiological effects and spiritual effects. There's societal acceptance of many of these things, at least in some measures. There's shared enjoyment, the sharing of a glass of wine, the sharing of a fine cigar, or a fine meal, or an enjoyable movie or theater or something. That shared experience brings some joy to the heart. But the substances are subject to misuse and abuse. So society tends to impose limits on the use, limiting access, controlling availability geographically or chronologically. You have to close your bars at 2 o'clock in the morning. You can't sell alcohol before 6 a.m. on Sundays, not before noon. You geographically used to have the safety in Lamar County that you had to go to Red River County to buy alcohol, and they put the store right at the county line because they knew where their customers were coming from, right? So geographical and chronological things limited. To get pornography, you had to go to that part of town during certain hours. It's very telling when society insists that warning labels be connected to things. Warning labels on cigarette packages, right? We know this is bad, but we put a warning on it, so we warned you before you used it. The gambling things for the casinos, if you have trouble with gambling, call this number, right? Okay, this is because we know that a lot of people that are coming have troubles, but it's going to be their fault because we told them where they could go to get help. Sometimes society goes to prohibition. In the United States, we have that experience where they went to prohibition with a constitutional amendment, if you can imagine such a thing. Banning alcohol. That worked so well. Right. What happens when you ban it? Then it becomes organized crimes activity and they make all the money instead of the tax revenue being paid to the state. So we then repeal prohibition. But there are drugs that we prohibit. That doesn't stop them from coming in. And it's arguably how much it slows down their use. But some of these substances are intentionally manipulated to increase the use, right? Tobacco is of its nature habit forming and addictive. But the tobacco industry, being clever people, it's like, you know, if we tweak it a bit, we can get that nicotine count up, and that nicotine thing really drives the addiction. So we'll sell more cigarettes. So they manipulate the already habit forming addictive thing to be more addictive. And in some measure, marketing is about making it more attractive, right? There's economic interests along with the social acceptability to it. Businesses, taxes, and windfalls. Obvious how businesses make money, right? Casinos, drugs, sales, shopping, networks, alcohol distribution. There's so much money to be made in it that Lamar County started selling beer and wine in Brookshire's grocery. 40 years ago, 30 years ago, probably 25 years ago, you would never have imagined a Brookshire's selling beer and wine in East Texas. It didn't come about as a change because people recognized that there's really nothing wrong with beer and wine, that really is a socially good thing, and that we should sell it. And this idea that the Baptists have against alcohol is not grounded in the scriptures, and we come to a more enlightened position. Why did they come to permit the selling of beer and wine in the stores? Money for the grocery stores selling the stuff, and tax money, most important of all, because that tax money is leaving Lamar County, right? It is strictly for the money. And when they started selling beer and wine in the grocery store, where did they put the beer and the wine? Prime center real estate, right? I went into a store a few months after, because I don't go to grocery store very often, and I walked in and I was shocked to find that they had pushed everything in the store apart and beer and wine center aisle of the store. I was also shocked at how long the beer and wine aisle was. It was as big as a cereal aisle. I'm like, pretty good for a place that never had grocery store selling beer and wine, that when they crank up, it cranks up full blown 4 sides of display cases for it, right? But only for the money. And the windfalls, the tobacco industry, $206 billion in the first 25 years of the settlement, a lot of that up front. But they agreed not only to over $150 billion up front, but at least $10 billion a year for 20 years or something like that. There's a lot of money to be made when you can pay a fine of $206 billion and stay in business, right? And the government is willing to let them stay in business because of the money. Because you don't tax cigarettes at just normal tax rates, what they used to call sin tax. They can't call it syntax anymore because there's no sin, right? Opioids. The opioid industry recently made a $50 billion settlement. There's a big meetings coming up at Notre Dame University, how to use this $50 billion in a way to help the people that's lives were impacted by the opioid addiction. Like, okay, I suspect that the group studying that's going to cost about $10 billion of that 50 billion at least, right? If 30 billion of it actually goes to people that were affected by the opioid crisis directly, I will be surprised, because the more experts that handle the money, the less of it gets to anybody to do good. But our society accepts and tolerates these things because there's a payoff. And if somebody's got a problem with alcohol, they need to get help. It's their problem. They got a problem with opioids. They got a problem with whatever it is, compulsive behavior. The internet provides a unique reality, because the internet has universal availability. It is at this point not geographically constrained nor chronologically constrained. Any time of the day or night, you have access to gambling, you have access to shopping, you have access to endless news feeds, to social media feeds. I mean, the whole thing with likes on Facebook, right? That's an endorphin, right? I need a hit. I need it. I need my drug of choice, whatever it may be. It's not just that pornography is addictive or shopping's addictive. The internet itself is addictive. The endless cycle of curiosity following up on articles, to not in a way that is of service or of glory, but that universal availability that any time of the day or night, you don't have to sneak down to a bad section of town. You don't have to go to the county line. You can take a hit right now. And it's instantaneous. So you develop a need for nearly endless hits. So people become addicted to social media, and they are on it all the time because they've got to get the endorphin hits of the likes. And when Facebook was maxing out how long they could keep people's eyes on screens, they adjust the algorithm to start popping up things that happened a year ago. Hey, remember when this happened? And people stop and go, oh yeah, wasn't that nice? Oh yeah, and this person was there and that person was there, right? What did I write about it back then? So they tool it to be even more addictive, not unlike the nicotine. As a principle, human beings find abiding joy in service and in accomplishments of value. That's where people find abiding joy. When you get done with the food pantry, you're tired, but you feel good about it. You don't go home and feel like, I just need to stuff a couple of more bags of food, right? Because the appetite has been satisfied in some measure. You eat 2 cookies before class, and at the break, you want 3 cookies, right? But we find abiding joy in service and accomplishments that are of value, doing things that are useful. So people that don't have useful things to do turn to substances to distract themselves from the emptiness, and it gets worse because they can never be satisfied, because they were created for something beyond just the satisfaction that comes from eating this cookie. Because same amount of calories, more or less, in a package of Oreo cookies and in a bag of apples. Anybody here ever eat a whole bag of apples at one time? They're really good with peanut butter, but have you ever eaten a whole bag of apples at one time? No. Almost nobody's eaten a whole bag of apples at one time. But eating a whole bag of Oreo cookies, we know people who would do that, right? Because you get done a whole package of Oreo cookies, what do you want? Milk and a few more cookies. Maybe ice cream to go with the next batch of cookies, right? Because that sugar, that appetite never satisfied. Pornography never satisfies the appetite. Shopping never really brings that satisfaction. You want the hit of finding the great value, and you got to look for even more hits. So the discipline of appetites is essential because of the fall. Because left to their own devices, they will take us into places that aren't good or healthy. Love and service is essential because of our creation in the image of God. We are created to love in a love that doesn't just seek our own good, but a love that seeks the good of the other. God's love has to be shared. This isn't just a religious idea, it's what we were created for. You can't make sense of the human person if you don't recognize our need to be of service to others. Social media. With social media, you got to remember the customer is always right. And who's the customer? The customer is the one who pays, the advertiser. We are not the customers of social media. We are the product that social media is selling. Social media sells to advertisers eyes on screens. We're the product being sold in social media. I was talking to my nephew and I said, we used to imagine the day would come where artificial intelligence would be working for us and we could like, hey, check and see what a good airfare is to this trip I want to take. We didn't realize that AI was going to be working for the airline industry and the hotel industry and the car industry. We thought they'd be working for us, doing our bidding, not feeding us into somebody else's bidding. But social media, we're not the customers, we're the product being sold. It is designed to keep eyes on screens. So when Facebook maxed out, they come up with this thing and say, what if we show a picture from last year? Oh, 35% of the people will click on that and follow it up and be online for an extra 30 seconds or a minute or 5 minutes or 10 minutes. But even worse than that, they're like, oh, this demographic likes to see pictures of their children from 5 years ago. This demographic wants to see pictures of their trips. Even worse than that, Father Gavin likes to see pictures of the cables that he bought because that's all they know about me. Because, right. But what does this particular person want? On the clickbait things, the captions aren't all the same. They're targeted to your demographics and as much as possible to you individually. There was a movie where they had optical recognition of people, and forget what movie it was, but the guy had an eye transplant so he could hide his identity. But as he was walking along, the billboards, the LED billboards, switched over to Japanese. And he realized, oh, yes, that's where my eyes came from, right? Because they recognized who he was, they thought, and they customized the billboards as he's walking down the street, the sidewalk, to him. We're not far from that. But social media allows freedom of expression and promotes freedom of expression that elicits a reaction from other people. If I post, Jesus is Lord, I get 3 amens, right? I post, you're not going to believe the atrocity they did in the opening ceremonies of the Olympics, and a firestorm erupts. Now, how much money is made off of the firestorm that erupts? Right? Why I don't talk too much about the specifics of the bad things with the opening ceremony. But it erupts into a huge way. I can't believe they did this. Can't interviews, comments, etc. You know nothing about it. You know about that. If it had been a beautiful ceremony, what would you know about the opening ceremony of the Olympics? It was really nice. 3 thumbs up. But how much advertising would they sell in connection with that? But that freedom of culture also leads to the cancel culture, because we don't want to tolerate certain voices, certain messages. But the cancel culture also feeds into another set of outrages. right? Because you cancel out a group of voices you don't want to hear and shouldn't be heard, but people are glad that they're canceled, and another group is outraged that they're canceled, and so it spirals a whole nother set of reactions. Social media is very much driven to have reactions, not responses. It's distractive, and it's designed to be addictive. Social media is designed to keep you on the app. And this is why the competition in the free market system, I forget what it was first, MySpace, Facebook, Instagram, chat, continually evolving different kinds of apps, different kinds of things, but all the same, consuming more and more time, more and more energy, and allowing people to sell more and more ads. It's a huge business. And it distracts people away from real relationships. This is a very classic scene, right? 3 people here now. I think there's a television on that table and they're watching a movie, right? They're streaming a movie while they're sitting there on their phones, checking on details, maybe even texting one another, right? But this is more and more how people spend their time and energy. It's addictive, and it's designed to be addictive in a way the tobacco industry could only dream of, right? So to be mindful of this reality, because we get sucked into reacting, right? An outrage happens in Paris, and well, I've got to weigh in on this because no one's going to know about this outrage if I don't post it and repost it and rebroadcast it. If you don't watch any media at all, you hear about it because it penetrates. That's how outrageous it was. But how much time and energy is it worth? And there's people whose entire life is consumed in no small measure, and it distracts them from all their problems. It's very common that people spend a lot of time working on those people's problems, but not their own. How does Jesus speak of this? Remove the beam in your own eye before you help your neighbor remove the splinter from their eye, right? But I don't have to look at mine if I can spend all my time someplace else. A little bit about moral theology prior to the Vatican II. Largely, moral theology had become following rules. Rules of what you do, books about in this particular circumstance, this is what you should do. And you just had to know the circumstances to find the right rule and follow the rules. And the problem with following the rules is when there's no longer any enforcing authority, people abandon the rules. And they're not people of character. They haven't formed virtues. They don't recognize the truth. And so in 1968, many Christians didn't recognize the need for marital relations to be limited to marriage, but to be open to life. And so contraceptives become broadly accepted. And right after that, abortion always follows in cultures. Contraceptive, then abortion is legalized. But because people in 1968 hadn't been formed as Christian disciples, they've been formed to follow a set of rules. So some theologians come along in the 60s with clever arguments or opinions and claim to provide a moral justification for doing something different than what Christians had always done. And the rule says that if there's a question about what to be done, you can follow a probable opinion of an expert. So they say, I'm an expert, and I say you could do this, even though no Christians have ever done this in the past. Well, there's a doubt about it, so I can follow him. So people aren't seeking the truth, but justification for their actions to feed their appetites. In principle, if there's a doubt, we are to give the assent of will and intellect to the teaching of the church. I have a doubt as to whether contraception is okay. Okay, what does the church teach? Not just what some random theologian teach. A theologian can be convinced that a couple could practice contraception and he has to live by his conscience, but somebody else doesn't have to live by, cannot live by his conscience. Some people question whether the earth is flat. Some people question whether man walked on the moon or not. The reality isn't changed by their questioning of it. But in a culture that is bound to the rules, people are not habituated to look for the truth and to recognize the truth. And so abortion in 1972 becomes largely about a rule, right? And this is, in fact, the way the debate goes on to this day. Women have a right to reproductive health. And nobody's asking the question, is the circumstance such that killing an innocent child is justified? Society doesn't want to ask that question because that sounds too much like, can you do evil that good may come of it? So morality tends to be binary, good or bad, right or wrong. Sometimes things are a matter of justice. Abortion is always wrong. It's unjust to kill an innocent child for the sake of somebody else. But many things in reality are three-dimensional. There's complicated values that have to be weighed and adjusted, and a prudential judgment needs to be made. And people can make different prudential judgments, but they should be able to agree about what is the truth. And the question is, how do we best defend the truth and promote the truth in this particular circumstance? Teleological is making moral decisions based on the consequences. And deontological is looking at the actions. Classically, Christian morality in the Western world was focused on the actions, not primarily the consequences. Our secular world has become more concerned about the consequences. As long as there are good consequences, it's okay, but evil can't be done that good may be accomplished. People go, pornography is a victimless crime. The consequence, well, except it's not victimless because the production of pornography is huge, evil, abusive of people, terrible. And it impacts real human relationships in a real way as well. But that tendency to start looking at the consequences and judging those disconnected from the action itself. Intrinsic evil, that there are some objects, some actions that by their nature of the action, it's always wrong. Killing an innocent person is always wrong. If you only look at the consequences, there's nothing that's intrinsically evil. Anything could be done under the right set of circumstances. This isn't classic Western Christian morality. Second effects are effects that are not the intention foreseen or desired. So if a woman is pregnant and has a bad cancer and needs to undergo radiation treatment right away and goes on the radiation treatment and the child dies, her intention was not to kill the child. It was to treat the cancer. The child died. Secondary effect. The woman could make a heroic choice and say, I am going to forego radiation treatment for the sake of the life of my unborn child and deliver the child and die. We call that kind of person a saint, right? Because they did the heroic thing, not just what they were obligated to have done in justice, but they loved as Christ loves, even unto death by cancer. Circumstances cannot justify doing evil. No matter, we had a professor in the seminary who was like, okay, this couple is really poor and they don't have any food. You know, can they go and rob the bank to get food? No. Well, there's a hurricane and an earthquake and it's like, no, you can't do wrong that good may come of it. The sanctity of life. The sacredness of every human person because they're created in God's image. It's not dependent upon the human person being healthy, happy, useful, productive, monetarily rewarded. Every human person from conception until natural death. This is the fundamental human dignity, without exception. Somebody who's retarded somebody who is suffering terribly, we don't have to extend their suffering, but we can't put them out of their misery because life is a sacred gift and we receive it, even if it's not what we want. As a principle for sanctity of life, things should be used according to their nature. That the human person should not be used as an object that's disrespectful to the human person. And children should be received as a gift from God. As a gift, not as a right. You may want a child, but you may not get one. You may prefer to have 2 children and may end up with a dozen children. It's a gift. But whatever path it is, it's not always going to be easy. But it's always going to be possible with the help of God's grace. The right to life is fundamental. Cain kills Abel and has a penalty. The blood of the earth cries out against Cain because he used the earth to try to hide his brother's blood. But God says, no, they can't just hunt you down and kill you. Cain has a right to life, and Cain's descendants have a right to life. When it says in the 10 Commandments, several different places, you shall not kill, it really would be rendered in English, you shall not murder. You shall not take an innocent human life. Because there are times in the Bible where precisely prescribed is the taking of the life of a sinner, of the enemy, of the pagan God worshippers. The prophet strikes down the 400 prophets of Baal, right? So we have to understand it's not any killing, it's murder of an innocent person. Our society often calls to follow the science, but if you follow the science, there's no question when human life begins. In 1972, some people claimed it's just a mass of cells. They really knew it wasn't. Ancient medical people understood fetal development because of miscarriages and things. They saw how the babies developed. Nobody really that was educated believed it was a mass of cells in 1972. But with ultrasounds and things, we'll see that in a second, there's no question. The DNA uniquely ordered at the moment of conception. That individual person is individualized at that moment. Capital punishment, in principle, capital punishment is not intrinsically evil. There were times in the scriptures where it was particularly called for. The church's teaching has become stronger and stronger that in the modern world, it becomes less and less justifiable. That in the modern society, it doesn't accomplish the right goal. And if you look at it, it doesn't turn out to be much of a deterrence because almost nobody who murders dies in capital punishment. It actually costs more money to kill somebody than to keep them alive for the rest of their lives because our processes are so efficient. But to recognize that the thing that a lot of people want to turn to capital punishment for is revenge. They took somebody's life, they should pay. That is not morally acceptable. We need to do this to protect ourselves as a society. This was classically the argument for capital punishment. I think an argument can be made for terrorism and treason that capital punishment may be necessary to protect the country. But for protecting against murder, probably not likely. But it's important, it's not intrinsically evil. Abortion, on the other hand, is intrinsically evil because abortion isn't really part of healthcare. Healthcare is about improving the health, right? Abortion is about terminating a healthy life. Pregnancy is not an illness. Pregnancy is a natural part of the life cycle. So what is the action done in abortion? The action done in abortion is the killing of a child. It's not we're treating cancer and the baby may die. We kill the child. We're not just generically terminating the pregnancy. We're killing the child in order to terminate the pregnancy. But the primary action is the killing of the innocent child. our society postures in terms of fighting for reproductive freedom. People are entitled to reproductive freedom. They shouldn't be raped. They should have freedom of deciding to engage in a marital act. But it's not reproductive freedom when you're killing the life of an innocent person. And if our society asks the question, is it acceptable to kill the life of an innocent person to make this person's life easier? Our society won't ask the question that way because the answer for society is going to be no. But we have an interesting phenomenon that the ultrasounds become clearer and clearer, and people now, it's like, see my child. And everybody says what? It's a mass of cells. What do you mean, child? Right? But we'll at the same time congratulate a woman on her child, and that woman can the very next day go down and have the child killed. There's no question that it's a child, but we do not as a society talk about it being a child. And in 50 years after Roe versus Wade, we have not changed the dialogue. You get the bishops arguing, we believe abortion is wrong. We don't want to have to fund it. That's not what you say when you believe that abortion kills an innocent person and we want no part of it. Who wants a part of killing innocent people? But the Supreme Court renders the law that says it's back down to state rights. States get to decide. And this is heralded by many people as a great decision. But what it says is states get to decide whether you kill children or not, because it's an arbitrary decision. Can we imagine the outrage if the Supreme Court decided that the federal ban on slavery doesn't hold and states get to decide on slavery and segregation? Right? A good decision of the Supreme Court would have been that human life is entitled to be respected and protected by law. But the pro-life community thrilled with the Dobbs decision. It's a terrible decision because it doesn't actually address the fundamental issue that we're, as a culture, we were up to, what was it, over a million a year, right? Now the surgical abortion counts down, but chemical abortions are up. So probably less than a million, but still an awful lot because of chemical abortions. Every human life is sacred from the moment of conception until natural death. And every human life is sacred until natural death. Life doesn't end when it ends being valuable or desirable. We do not have to, at the end of life, extend life as much as possible. We don't have to prolong life, especially not doing things that are extraordinary and burdensome. People can do extraordinary things, but you don't have to respect life, hook people up to life support and keep their body going as long as possible. People can face a natural death. Hydration and nutrition is never medical care. It is basic human rights. So you cannot discontinue hydration and nutrition. Questions? Albert Einstein said, "The world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who watch them without doing anything." Albert Einstein wasn't a terribly religious person, but he was a realist, right? It's not the people that do evil that are the greatest problems. It's the people who don't do anything in the face of evil. And we are called to recognize human beings created in the image and likeness of God and respect the sanctity of each person, and to cultivate the habit of not getting sucked into reaction, not getting played for money, for power, for influence, but how to respond with love in complicated circumstances. As Reagan's quote the other day, right? There aren't easy answers, but they're simple answers. Do the morally right thing. This is what we're called to do, to love one another and not just to love our neighbor, but to love one another as God has loved us first. Questions? Let us pray. In the Father and Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. In the Father and Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So tomorrow night we will pick up where we left off and have a few more things. We're at the same place in the morning session and the evening session. We're holding even pacing on that, thankfully.